This is the IBJ podcast for the week of Monday, February 24th, 2025, brought to you by Taft. I'm your host, Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. You might have a sense of this already, if not the full story, but Indiana has long been a national leader in historic preservation. Hoosiers have a strong record for studying, cataloging, and saving homes and churches, farms and factories, covered bridges, monuments, courthouses, hotels, libraries, and even entire commercial districts and neighborhoods deemed to have historic value. Often the properties then take that opportunity to continue their useful lives. Since being founded in 1960, the nonprofit group Indiana Landmarks has promoted and supported historic preservation efforts, often at or near the center of major projects, or helping bring the right parties to the table and acting as an advisor. It has 43 full-time employees and 9 field offices across Indiana, and is considered the largest statewide historic preservation organization in America. Marsh Davis has worked for Indiana Landmarks for 37 years, the last 19 of which as the group's president. He is retiring on April 15th, but is headed right back into historic preservation as the new owner of a large Victorian home in New Harmony that needs a considerable amount of work. Leading by example has been one of the themes of his tenure. His legacy includes the $24 million restoration of the former Central Avenue Methodist Episcopal Church in Indianapolis. Finished in 2011, it became the group's statewide headquarters, as well as a multi-space events venue in the city's Old Northside Historic District. With a handful of weeks left in his tenure, I sat down with Davis to discuss the value of historic preservation and its influence on Indianapolis, the projects that stand out over 4 decades, the one that got away, and how he hopes his tenure as president will be remembered. In the interest of full disclosure, with a smidge of context, I was a marketing intern for Landmarks back in 1991, so I know Marsh from that period. And both of my parents have been volunteers for Landmarks going back several decades. So here's our conversation. It's my pleasure to welcome to the podcast Marsh Davis, President and CEO of Indiana Landmarks. Thanks for making time today and hosting me at the Indiana Landmarks Center at 1201 Central Avenue.
Thank you, Mason. Glad to be here.
So we're in your office right now, and you've already started cleaning up a little bit. How much of the stuff is going to end up in your house?
None of the furniture. Well, the clocks will, and most of the art and the busts, but yeah, most of it's going to end up in the house.
Yeah, we actually had to turn off a few of the clocks. It was like, Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon in here for a little bit. Why do you have so many clocks?
Well, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I've got like 8 or 9 more of the tall clocks at home. I don't know. It's just my father told me once you can't have too many clocks, so I was going to follow his lead. Just they're fun to collect,
Yeah, they're beautiful. I mean, what we would consider grandfather clocks or really elaborate wall clocks. So time will become a theme in this interview. So, in your experience, when you've announced that you're leaving a significant nonprofit organization and have a hard exit date, do you find that you have even more to do than usual to wrap things up and prepare for a new leader, or do you find that people start feeling more comfortable leaving you out of things?
Well, certainly have more to do. I mean, yes, I look at my calendar now, and I'm desperately trying to fit in meetings and trips with different communities, meetings with potential donors. Still, I'm not going to coast to April 15th. I'm really as busy as ever right now, and it's a little scary because there's so much I want to get done, and I've got just like 7 weeks or so.
Mm-hmm. So April 15th is the hard exit date. At my church, for example, when a pastor leaves, I mean, you can't come back in the building. You really, like, being in touch with people in the congregation is frowned upon. I mean, is that going to be your way of dealing with it, or are you going to be available?
Well, I hope that I'm not barred from the building.
Probably
This
not.
is kind of my baby here. So no, but I'm not going to get in the way either. It depends really on the person that's hired. And if they feel a need for kind of an overlap, some introductions, I hope one of the best things I can do is introduce my successor to some of the key people. And depending on when that person comes on board, I'll know how much time I have to do that. But no, I'm not going to haunt the halls and be hanging out here, because I see that in some other positions. Like, just hang it up, you're done.
Okay.
So yeah, and plus we bought a home in New Harmony. So we'll be spending most of our time down there, which is a 2 hours and 45-minute drive from here. So it's not like I'm going to be hanging around.
Oh, that's exciting. And you've bought the home already?
Yeah.
Okay. Is it a historically significant home?
It is, yeah. It's a great big Victorian monstrosity. It was designed by a guy named George Barber, who did his houses were all over the country. He was a catalog architect. People would buy his plans and build them, but a lot of them are very big, kind of gaudy, overwrought. It's not a style I particularly like, but it's an impressive house nonetheless.
Okay. That's really fascinating. Are you thinking about putting a lot of work into the house?
It needs a lot of work, like all these houses do, but it's certainly livable. But lots of painting and patching and lots of stuff.
Yeah. So, what was the calculus besides maybe your age, mid-60s, that went into deciding this was time to go?
Well, I've been in this job for 18 years, and I think it's time for some fresh leadership and ideas. I've gotten more done than I had really set out to do. So I think the organization is in really good shape. I want to go out on a high note, and we've got a great board. Our staff is a wonderful team here, and our financial position is strong. So I feel it's a good time to. Plus, 67. That's I'll have a little bit of time.
Yeah, a little bit of time to.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to live. I don't expect to live super long, so I want to have a few years to mess around.
Okay. So I think a lot of people are aware of Indiana Landmarks, but I want to make sure that they have a good sense of the mission and the specific work. To the extent that the people think of Landmarks as an organization that saves old buildings, mm-hmm. which is, we'll get into more of it in a second, but what is the point of saving old buildings?
Well, let me just talk about the origin of the organization for a second, because I think that's important. We were founded in 1960. It was actually 1959. A group of business leaders got together at the Columbia Club, and with the idea of pondering, should we form an organization that is similar to some that were elsewhere in the country that would basically protect some of the landmarks, which were disappearing pretty quickly back in those days, a lot of demolition. And so the idea was not it wasn't centered around stopping some development. It was, can we save some stuff for the next generation, for our kids? Kind of an intentional, forward-looking approach to preservation. And then, so that was, they were organized in 1960, didn't really do anything until 1965. Then they took on the Morris Butler House, which was our first big project. And Mr. Eli Lilly was behind that effort, both financially and philosophically, and was pleased with the results. So finally got it done in 1969. And that was really the beginning of this organization as a professionally staffed. He left he seeded our endowment, which is an important part of our operation here. And so with that, we became a professional organization and gradually grew. In the 70s, Landmarks recruited Reed Williamson from Savannah, who had learned some of the techniques of that era with revolving funds, buying and selling property, and so forth. And gradually, in that era, we became a statewide organization. So now we have 9 offices around Indiana, which is unlike any other similar organization in the country. So we're the largest statewide nonprofit preservation organization in the country.
When you say largest, what is the measure for that?
Well, I would say certainly staff, programs, financial resources. I think we're probably at the top in terms of membership. There may be some larger ones, but if you put it all together, mm-hmm. And the fact that we have these field offices throughout the state, it's just very rare.
For folks who didn't grow up like immediately near here, what is the significance of the Morris Butler House?
Well, it was I can't even tell you who Morris and Butler were all these years here, but it was the significance of the house was it was a great example of Civil War era architecture and an upper middle class home, and it was used to educate people about the way of life in those days. It was a Victorian house museum. Mm-hmm. It's no longer a museum. We use it now for offices and events but unlike, say, the James Whitcomb Riley home, which has a very specific story and a person that people know about, or at least used to know about, the Morris Butler house, it really wasn't about the people. It was about the era and the furnishings.
Mm-hmm. And significantly, we're about a stone's throw away from the Morris Butler house.
That it's significant and totally coincidental that we're back where we started, because we had no idea, even when I started this job 18 years ago, that we would be leaving our headquarters on the canal for this taking on this old Methodist church. It was just totally coincidental that we're back where we started.
What is the economic development argument for historic preservation?
Well, there's so many different aspects of it, starting with the resources that are embedded in a historic property by not demolishing and losing all the energy and materials. If you preserve a historic neighborhood as opposed to building a new one out in the cornfields, you're not having to add infrastructure like sewer and water. Like it's really makes a lot of sense to preserve what already exists. And there are some of the more intangible aspects of it that people like being in historic buildings. What are the popular spots here in downtown Indianapolis? We like Massachusetts Avenue. It's that older fabric that even if there's no specific history known about it, that people gravitate to.
Mm-hmm. I was going to bring that up, and I always have to be careful about inserting myself into these interviews, but I will tell you the way that I've always connected historic preservation to economic development. So I think this was 1976, and I was about 8 years old, if that's true. There was a lot of bicentennial stuff around. Yeah. And I remember being at a block party in Lockerbie Square that was serving as some kind of kickoff for the preservation effort for the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I think there's still fairly little organized preservation of downtown neighborhoods. And, my theory, of course, placing myself right in the middle of it, is that the revival of Lockerbie was the spark that eventually turned the whole northeast quadrant of downtown, including Mass Ave, which is completely transformed in the last 30 years, into arguably the hottest residential and commercial sector of the county.
Yeah.
I mean, is there something to that?
Oh, yeah. And I don't think, I believe that I wasn't there then, but we collectively underestimated the potential of that. For instance, Lockerbie was considered like the project, and so houses were moved from neighborhoods like Chatham Arch that because nobody thought that the preservation movement would ever extend into those neighborhoods, and those are now the hotbeds too. And then it's moving north through the Old Northside. We, the preservation movement, underestimated the power and the impact that we would ultimately have on livability of downtown and cities and towns across America.
Okay, let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
Taft, today's modern law firm. With more than 800 attorneys in 8 primary Midwest markets and the District of Columbia, we provide solutions to the business issues facing middle market and emerging companies alike. We do this through a highly collaborative and inclusive team approach. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
We're back with this week's edition of the IBJ Podcast and my interview with Marsh Davis about leading the nation's largest statewide historic preservation organization. So I imagine a lot of people think like the main work of Landmarks is giving people money to fix up old buildings and putting up historical markers around the state and occasionally telling city councils that they shouldn't let somebody tear down a building because it's historically significant. But there is a whole universe of things that Landmarks does to encourage preservation and guide preservation of historic places around the state, including helping people and organizations get grant funds from a variety of sources. Give me the elevator pitch for this one, all the stuff that Landmarks does.
Well, you're right. It's not just about saving old buildings. We have so many programs that help people appreciate their own communities and find value in their own main streets. We have an active tour program, and we have also a Black Heritage Preservation program, which gets us kind of outside just the building stuff. We're talking about cultural events and places where a building may not even exist, but it's important in the history of the community. Thanks to the Lilly Endowment, we have a very robust Sacred Places program where we work to strengthen religious congregations and are granting millions of dollars once they've gone through some training and capacity building, millions of dollars in capital grants to help congregations maintain their historic places of worship. One of the neat things about being around so long is to see the growth, the evolution, expansion of the preservation movement. When I started, it was mostly about high-style buildings. But we learned one of my first projects was to serve as a rural project manager to learn about stuff outside the cities and towns, like barns and little outbuildings. And instead of looking just at the high-style architecture, we got into vernacular architecture, which is like 95% of what the built environment consists of. So we've been broadening the relevance of preservation. And then you dig deeper into things like Black heritage and learn that it's not just about a great piece of architecture. It's about culture and events and that happened in places that don't have maybe the architectural significance. So we've gotten, I think, way off of the homes of the rich white men into a much more broad and relevant movement.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Lilly Endowment a couple times now. It is now a multi-billion-dollar endowment, one of the largest endowments in the country.
Mm-hmm.
How important over the last, I guess, 70 years now, 60 years now, has the endowment been to the mission of historic landmarks?
Well, I mentioned first the endowment by Mr. Lilly. That was not Lilly Endowment. So people have for years and years said, "Well, you're funded entirely by Lilly Endowment." No, that relationship is actually fairly recent, and the endowment's been very good. But I would say over time, maybe it's been overstated, but certainly in recent years, the endowment has been critical. Our Black Heritage Preservation program. Not entirely, but most of it is funded through the endowment. Our Sacred Places program, which is entirely funded by the endowment through the religion division. So I think just more importantly, the importance of the endowment to the health and culture of our community and ultimately the state is you can't really overstate that. Mm-hmm. So it all builds to a friendly environment for cultural organizations such as Indiana Landmarks.
To what degree do the operating budget of Landmarks and the programs of Indiana Landmarks rely on federal funding and other kinds of federal assistance?
None of our operating, we are not federally funded or state funded. We occasionally do a project that receives funding. I'll give you one example. Up in the Indiana Dunes National Park, we lease from the National Park Service 5 houses that were part of the Chicago World's Fair, and they're in Beverly Shores now. And one of them is called the House of Tomorrow. And it's a very complicated house, a 12-sided glass house. And we were able to get the other 4 houses restored, but the House of Tomorrow remained kind of it eluded us for some time until the National Park Service had the Great American Outdoors Act was passed by Congress. Bipartisan. Trump claimed credit for it. Pelosi claimed credit for it. It was a good program to address deferred maintenance in our national parks. And this was a poster child for deferred maintenance. So that's an example of a project that is receiving federal funds. But it's actually owned by the federal government anyway. The property is still owned by the National Park Service. So as far as the impact directly on Indiana Landmarks and our operating, no, we're reliant on federal or state funds, but there are many wonderful programs that we work with that can be impacted by it. And I know there's a lot of consternation right now about what's going to happen, for instance, with the National Park Service. We don't know who's going to be furloughed. I don't know the status of the things that we rely on to carry out historic preservation. Largely the federal rehabilitation tax credit. If we lose that, man, you're talking about a major economic development tool that would be disastrous for historic preservation. There's the Historic Preservation Fund, which funds our state preservation offices. Doesn't fund us, but it funds like the State Office of State Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology. Every state has a state preservation office, and those are funded to some extent by this National Preservation Fund.
Mm-hmm.
It could all be, we're in a kind of a scary time right now.
Yeah, look, obviously the Trump administration is going through the federal budget with a fine-tooth comb. And finding
with a chainsaw, but
yeah, sure. Any way you want to say it, yeah. And so, anybody who relies on federal funds obviously is feeling a lot of anxiety. So let's work backwards a little bit. So where did you grow up?
I grew up mostly in Lake County. I was born in Gary, and I started grade school here in Indianapolis, but we moved back to Lake County when I was still in grade school and finished high school there.
Okay. Was there anything in your background that would lead you to be interested in historic preservation?
Yeah, I don't know. I always liked old buildings instinctively, but I think it was. I really know. I mean, I grew up in very, very bland middle class ranch houses, one story.
Careful, that's where I live now.
Nothing wrong with it, but that was my. Of course, those are historic now too. No, I don't really know. I know I took a course at Butler that I had a couple wonderful history professors at Butler, and one of them was largely about art and architectural history, and I was fascinated by it. So I would say that was one of the sparks, being introduced by way of as being a history student with a teacher who was more focused on art and architecture than battles and kings and.
Right, because you studied history at Butler, and you graduated.
I did.
From Butler. Yeah. Very good. How quickly did you then go to Ball State to get your master's? And is it correct to say you get a master's in historic preservation?
Well, I took a year off. I got interested in. I wanted to do architectural photography, but I didn't know anything about it. So I went to the camera store. I said, "Well, you need to use a large format camera." And I said, "What's that?" So I tried to enroll at Heron, but I didn't have a portfolio, so they wouldn't talk to me. So I ended up in almost like a vocational. It's more than that. A school in New York City. It's called the Germain School of Photography. It's got a different name now, but it was down in the Financial District. It was a great experience. That's why I learned to use a large format camera, which came in useful later in life. All the stuff I did for Landmarks in my early years.
Mm-hmm. How did you end up at Landmarks initially? There was an internship, is that right? Or a fellowship?
Yeah. So I went to Ball State to get a master's in historic preservation through the College of Architecture and Planning. And the best thing that happened to me there was I got a graduate assistantship to work at Indiana Landmarks, which was then called Historic Landmarks Foundation of Indiana. And we were located in the cemetery. And I was basically just a gopher, and I loved it. I just taken on all kinds of odd jobs and kind of what you did when you were turning 40.
This was, a Crown Hill Cemetery. Yeah. And I forget the name of that building. I mean, it was kind of a cool old building.
Called the Waiting Station.
The Waiting Station.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Most of us worked down in the basement, though. It was not cool down there.
Okay. No, it wasn't.
But so that's how I got associated with Indiana Landmarks, and stayed there for a while doing some intern level projects. And then for a year I worked for a company in Bloomington, but they had a contract with the state of Michigan. So I traveled all over the state of Michigan doing National Register nominations. Then came back to Landmarks to do more field survey work. And as I say, I started at the bottom and I stayed there a long time.
But this is really interesting, the field survey work. In Indiana, were you in all 92 counties at some point?
Oh, no. I mean, we would do like 3 counties in a summer.
Oh, okay. So my understanding that you use research from your master's thesis to help develop survey methods for recognizing rural structures. You mentioned them earlier, like barns and simple houses.
Yeah, my thesis was on vernacular house types because my assignment was as a field surveyor was to go out, cover every road, drive every road in the given county, and look at every visible structure and determine, is it historic? Should it be recorded? And if so, what is it? So all we were doing was we would look at a farm, and if it had brackets under the eaves, we call it Italianate. Well, what does that tell you? It doesn't tell you anything except a very superficial style element. So I thought we needed a methodology to identify house types. And there's significance behind the house types, like what culture brought them to Indiana and things like that. So that was my thesis, yeah.
Okay.
And we used it ever since. I found my thesis and some of my drawings have been actually borrowed without permission in other publications. So
that's how you know you've made it.
Yeah.
When they steal your stuff.
When I taught it for 5 years at Ball State, and I used to go down to the library where my thesis was bound, and I would hide it in some place so that people wouldn't crib from it.
There you go. So in the process of the work, you got involved in preserving covered bridges, which, I mean, we now think of as significant drivers of tourism in rural Indiana. Park County has a festival every year. They'll seemingly last an entire month for covered bridges. And there are other things like that around the state. How were covered bridges viewed in the 1980s?
Well, I was doing a project in Rush County. I was doing a survey work in Rush County, and they were famous for their covered bridges. They had 6, and there was maybe 7 to count one. There's a shed out in the farm field, but they had 6 of these really nice bridges designed by the Kennedy brothers, and the commissioners were planning to take down 4 of the 6, and they had no interest in them. They bothered the farmers because they'd have to go around like an extra mile to get their equipment across. So there was a lot of antipathy toward the covered bridges. And I thought it was crazy, and nobody would listen to me. I went with like a historical society there, and they said, well, we've done something 10 years ago, but they're too far gone now. So I kept hearing that. And so finally I connected with a guy named Larry Stout, and he sent a letter to Historic Landmarks Foundation, and nobody wanted to deal with it, so they tossed it down to me. So I called Larry and said, hey, I'm an outsider. Could you convene a meeting of people, and let's talk about these bridges? And he did, and I had brought an engineer down to look at the bridges, and he said, "There's nothing wrong with these things. You can just replace a little bit here and there. They're perfectly fine." So the community had been lied to by the commissioners and their engineers about the condition of these bridges. So about 200 people showed up for that meeting. It was just great, and it was like we were on a roll after that. We formed an organization. We fought, and one of the bridges was destroyed by arson. But the other 5 remain, and we unseated county commissioners. This is all pre even cell phone, or it was all you meet in person in those days, and not do things through Zoom meetings. But it was a great experience, but the beauty was, I think it was about 2009. A tornado went through the town of Moscow, which has the largest of the covered bridges down there, just pulverized it. The county commissioners voted immediately to rebuild it, and keep it open to traffic. The very things that we had to fight tooth and nail in earlier decades. So it was a 180-degree turnaround.
And then you became director, or perhaps this was also in that time frame, director of community
services.
It
was just a catch-all name, just made-up name because I had odd things I was working with. By that point, I was overseeing the survey program, the library, working on African American heritage. It was just a catch-all.
Okay.
Yeah. It just sort of, yeah.
So in 2002, you left Indiana to become executive director of the Galveston Historical Foundation in Texas. Yeah. So Galveston is a fascinating community which I imagine had some very urgent preservation needs given its position right on the Gulf. Yeah. When Indiana Landmarks' former president, Reed Williamson, announced he was leaving, why did you want to come back in 2006?
Well, first of all, the job I had down there was good. It wasn't like I was just pining to come back to Indiana, because that's a destination job down there. It's a great organization. It's every bit as large in staff as we have here in Indiana, believe it or not.
I looked it up on Google as I do for these interviews, and and Google shows you at a certain view, important things in the area. And the first 2 things that it brought up were both related to historic preservation. Yeah.
Well, that town was saved by historic preservation. It was really That's not any overstatement. But it's a very, very vibrant, small city. I mean, to have a big organization like that is really quite remarkable. But it was not. We were not quite as financially secure, so it was a lot of raise it, spend it kind of thing going on. A great experience, but a very vibrant little city.
Okay, but Indiana was calling to you.
Well, I applied for the job, and I went the first interview. I told my wife, I was back in Galveston. I said, "Forget about it. It's not going to happen." So, but it did. And but to answer why would I consider it? Well, this is such an outstanding organization. I thought it would be a great honor to be a part of it, and it has been. So, I think anybody that's looking to advance in the world preservation should have applied for the job because it's good.
So over the last, what are we calling this, 18 or 19 years?
Well, it's been 18 and some months. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you what projects or programs stand out to you the most. And let me just throw it out to you. Lyle Station. Yeah,
one of my favorites. Of course, that happened largely during my previous stint at Landmarks, because it was dedicated. The groundbreaking was in 2002, or the ribbon cutting, I should say, was 2002, and I was already in Texas, but I came back for it. We worked on that for years and years. It's the last black farming community in Indiana, and the building was a total wreck, and now it's just a wonderful success. And if you haven't been to Lyle Station, it's a little bit of a destination, but it's worth it.
And what kind of work would you contribute to that process? I mean, you weren't there with hammer and nails and telling contractors what to do. What is Landmarks' role in that kind of situation?
Well, first I was forming an organization, having a local nonprofit, and we worked with. Now, this is a case where public dollars were critical. We for years and years we were trying to. First we had to acquire the property. It was held by somebody who wanted just like way too much for it, and so he finally agreed to sell it for a reasonable price. Then when we had control of the building, we started raising funds for it. But it was really we had some folks working for us in Washington at the time, and they found some money through the U.S. Department of Agriculture that was directed toward black farmers, and it's the black farming community. And so working with, it was again bipartisan, the local congressman who was Republican, and Julia Carson here in Indianapolis secured funding through the USDA, but it took like 2 years to get the money. And meanwhile, the building was just coming in on itself. So you're talking about many, many meetings with the USDA here. So we had to hold hands. Ours was a hand-holding process throughout the many years that it took to reach the restoration. But yeah.
There was the restoration of Evansville's Art Moderne Greyhound Bus Depot.
Yeah.
Which was not something that I was super familiar with. How did that come about?
Well, it was a much loved building in Evansville, but it had been vacant for a long time, and it was just deteriorating. And it took a few years, but we got the city to donate it to us. And we thought, well, how are we going to raise money to restore it? And we thought, well, we'll use it for some nonprofit purpose, and we'll get the local foundations down there. I said, wait a minute, now what is Evansville? They don't need another nonprofit down. They need a restaurant. So we started courting restaurateurs from throughout quite a radius, and we were ultimately introduced to Mike Cunningham with Cunningham Restaurant Groups here.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, he's been on the podcast a couple times.
So we put the full squeeze on him, and it was of course, his first project in Evansville, but he did it with some skepticism. And it was a total restoration. Place looked great. Hundreds of people came out when we lit the neon running dog. I mean, hundreds of people were there for that. I understand it's the most successful in that Brewburger chain.
It's a Brewburger.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. The building that we are in currently. I mean, this is a bit of a story, but why don't you tell it?
Well, this was we're in the what was historically the Central Avenue Methodist Episcopal Church, later the United Methodist Church. And it went out of business in the 90s. It was a large building built in three sections from 1891, 1900, and 1922. So it's a big, kind of hulking building. And by the mid-90s, it was, the Methodists left. And it was a local group got together to just save the building. They called it the Old Centrum, and they had kind of low-end nonprofits working out of here. And there was a food pantry. Anyway, so the reason that we took this on, it wasn't to save this building necessarily. Even before this was available, I mean, I'd been having conversations with our team at the previous headquarters, like, we need a venue, a place where we can convene lots of people in an inspiring, historic place. So we started looking around. That idea preceded the demise of the old Centrum Foundation. But when that happened, I took my board chair over here to look at. He thought I was out of my mind. Because this place was a mess, and there was no plan B for it. So we thought, well, if we can raise the money for it, let's do it. And thank God for the Cook family that paid not the entire thing, but the majority of the restoration costs were paid for by Bill Gale Cook.
Mm-hmm. What was the total cost of the restoration?
I think it was $24 million.
Yeah, I think that's
24 million.
24.
Yeah. And Bill was It took about a year of cultivation. It wasn't just like, hey, let's do this. We had events here. I mean, Dick Lugar came by. We had Jane Owen from New Harmony stopped in on her way to Newport. It was we had a couple events, but finally we had what I called the Hail Mary. It was in November of 2009, 2008, 8 or 9, I can't remember. And we had brass players playing in the building, and that Bill loved brass. He produced a Broadway show called Blast. So the brass players put him over the edge. We shook hands. He said, "We'll do this. It'll take a couple million. We'll get it done." But I tell you, it was his last project, and he was here every week for construction meetings, 8 a.m. and hands-on. He was and Gail as well. So it really, I think it kept him going his last years, the months. And he did get to see it. There was a wedding, kind of a trial run wedding before we officially opened, and he was here for that. And then he died the day before our grand opening.
Oh, wow. So like you say, this is a big building. So I'm looking over here. Do we call that the sanctuary?
Well, the Methodists called it an auditorium because it was in those days. They wanted it to be auditory. So, yeah, most people call it the sanctuary. We now call it the Grand Hall. Mm-hmm. But it was, the auditorium sanctuary.
Right. And so all manner of events could happen there, meetings, performances. I believe Kava Akbar was there, the writer.
Yeah.
Had a who's has a lot of connections in Indianapolis, had an event there recently. And then in the back, and forgive me, I'm bad with my church terms. In the back of the building, there also is a stage and office space.
That we call the Cook Theater. That was designed as a Sunday school wing that had classrooms around a central meeting space. So a lot of our work, a lot of the events we have here are weddings. And so this place works perfectly for weddings because you have the wedding in the grand hall, and then you go across the hall into Cook Theater for a catered dinner. So, or dancing if you want. And it functions very well for weddings.
And the building that we are in currently, is this a new building?
This is 1922. So
so this was here too.
Yeah.
And this is, it's rectangular.
Yeah, it's just kind of bland. It's a Sunday school wing that had classrooms, offices. There was a gymnasium down in the basement, which is now our library. So this was a very vibrant congregation before World War II, probably the biggest in the state of Methodist. And by all indications, Methodist Hospital was an outgrowth of this congregation, some funds they had. So very, very important. This was Richard Lugar's church. He was here for the ribbon cutting.
Is that right?
Got a picture of him up there. So
okay. Yeah, and it's, folks really need to come down here and check it out. Here is at 1210 Central, if you haven't already. And it's not just, hey, we're going to put $20 million in this to fix it up. It is restoration. You're taking elements that were 100 years old that disappeared or were broken or severely compromised, get renewed.
Yeah, well, one of the things I love about this place is we get tens of thousands of people come through here. They have no knowledge of what Indiana Landmarks is. They're here for maybe a corporate event or a wedding, but they walk into that grand hall and without exception, they look up and say, "Wow, this is really, really great." So we're reaching out to people that, tens of thousands of people that we would not have, we'd otherwise have no connection to, and also working with Bill Cook, the same team that did the West Baden Springs restoration.
Right.
It was the same team, the architect, the decorative painters, they did this building, and there's a lot of stuff in there that we wouldn't have done, like a lot of gold leaf. Bill called it the Mary Kay. He liked the little extra touch. So that his hand is in a lot of this, and it's a better project because of that.
As you look back over 30 some years, what's the one that got away? Was there one that you are particularly steamed that you tried to save and couldn't save?
Well, there are many along the way that what I was not involved with, but one that was particularly painful to me was at North Manchester College, now university. That was where my mother's family was from. My great uncle was president of the college. So a few years ago, their administration building, the biggest historic building on campus, they decided they were going to take it down. And they did, and they took down also my grandparents' house right across the street, my great uncle's house. He's the guy that saved that institution. So that had both a professional and personal disappointment. And we had a plan that could have worked if they had to mothball the building until. It's most colleges and universities don't have excess square footage. They're usually trying to create more. And so we were hoping that if we could park some money there with them to mothball the building, keep it alive until a new use could be found. But it's all gone, just grass. So that was one disappointment. And from a more programmatic disappointment is our unending quest to get a state historic preservation tax credit. Indiana is one of like 12 states that does not have a tax credit for historic rehabilitation. And it's been a huge tool for revitalization. And a lot of our developers go to Ohio, which has a robust tax credit. A friend of mine is a developer. He's going to West Virginia because he can get the incentives there that we don't have. Mm-hmm. So that's been a long-term quest. We're still working at it, the current legislative session as we speak. Hopefully we can get something in place.
This seems like the kind of job where, 80% of what you do is persuade people to do things. You can't force people to do things. You really need to convince them of the value of what you want to do and then persuade them to do it. Sometimes against, maybe what they originally wanted to do. Mm-hmm. Am I onto something there? How important is that for the job?
Oh, that's a lot of what we do. One of the projects that I was involved with was the old St. Vincent Hospital. They wanted that thing down yesterday. They did every argument they toss out that, we can't do this because the load-bearing walls will not allow us to create classrooms. It was taken over by Ivy Tech. And so Tom Snyder, who was the president of Ivy Tech at the time, was gracious enough to allow a committee to convene over time. But one by one, everyone peeled away from that, and Landmarks and one other person, myself and another, we just said, no, you can't tear this down. Let's find a solution. Ultimately, Wayne Schmidt, who was the architect, relented and came up with a plan to build out from so the main facade and the corridors remain of the historic building, but they built out. And when I went to the ribbon cutting for that, all they could talk about was this wonderful historic building that is now in their hands. It was like when it becomes somebody else's idea, your idea becomes somebody else's. That's a success. And I was pleased with it. And I think that the purists might say, well, it wasn't a 100% accurate restoration, but I'd say it's a 90%. So
that's amazing. So you have to look out for being the finger wagging guy, but you also need to.
There's another thing too. People say, well, we do ask for financial support from people because a lot of what we do does not pencil out, doesn't make sense. We take a loss on projects. Our first forays into some of the historic neighborhoods here, they cost more than you can ever get out of it financially, but it serves as a catalyst for others to start investing. And so with that in mind, we ask for contributions. We're a nonprofit organization, charitable public charity organization, and then the reason for that is to help us offset the cost of doing things. But people say, well, I see it as more like salesmanship. I mean, if you believe that a healthy, vibrant, restored downtown is good for your community, that's we got a product we're actually selling. It's not just an idea; it's an actual product that improves people's lives. Mm-hmm. So that's how I see it.
Right. You've got to get back to your work here in a second. But in about a month or so, some people are going to get up to a microphone and try to encapsulate your legacy. What do you want them to say?
As little as possible. Because, no, one thing that I hope I have made a difference in here is historic preservation, and rightly so in some circumstances, is seen as a kind of a negative thing. Like, I'm telling you what you can't do with your property, or the restrictive part of preservation, the regulatory. I've tried to recast Indiana Landmarks as a problem-solving entity, not one that tells you what you can't do, but how can we help you do projects? And I think that has made a difference. I've heard people in the community even remark on that, where we're much less litigious than maybe we were 30 years ago, I hope, but trying to find solutions as opposed to being obstacles to things. It's one thing to say, well, to stop something from happening, but how do you actually enable something, the good to happen through preservation? So that is, if there's any change in the culture here, I hope that would be recognized.
Besides working on your new house, how do you expect to spend your time?
Well, it's going to take probably a year to move in, and because we got a lot of stuff and it's a big house. I plan to do some kind of volunteer work that I've not been able to do because of the time constraints here. I'm on a couple boards down there that will keep me busy as well. So I'm not leaving the world of preservation by any stretch. Just not going to be here at Indiana Landmarks.
Yeah.
It's been a good run. I feel great about the condition of the organization. So it's time to move on.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing the story with me. My thanks again to Marsh Davis. And folks, before you get on with the rest of your week, there are a few stories in this week's edition of IBJ I want to draw to your attention. First up, potential rollbacks of Biden-era policies that incentivized electric vehicle production and ownership have stirred apprehension among economic development officials across the state. IBJ's Mickey Shuey reports on where things stand for billions of dollars in Indiana projects for electric vehicle and battery manufacturers. Also in this week's issue, Daniel Lee takes stock of the headwinds blowing against Indianapolis-based health insurance giant Elevance, including the challenge of meeting Wall Street expectations, while criticism of insurer profits grows louder. And Dave Lindquist has the story on the latest album by Reverend Peyton's Big Damn Band, which is finding old school success with a firm grip on the modern music industry. And again, you can find these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or online at ibj.com. I will say that it is quite a bit easier to access all of the latest local business news and all of IBJ's data on Central Indiana's business community and economy if you're a subscriber. We're running a promotion right now that gives you complete access for $1 per week for 3 months, just to get a sense of how valuable and original this content is. Just go to ibj.com and click on the subscribe button. And thanks again for making time this week for the IBJ podcast. I'm Mason King. Hang in there, everybody. We'll be back again next week.